Thank you everyone for coming. We're so glad that you took time out of your busy schedule to be here with us. My name is Alisa Kaplan. I'm the Executive Director of Reform for Illinois. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, Reform for Illinois is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that was founded in 1997 by former Senator Paul Simon and Lieutenant Governor Bob Kustra, a Democrat and a Republican. For 25 years, we've worked to make Illinois government more democratic and less corrupt by fighting for election reform, ethics reform, and campaign finance reform, and by educating the public with forums like this. Our vision is a more ethical, equitable Illinois government that works for everyone. It's that intersection of ethics and equity that brings us here today. We all love to hate our property taxes in Illinois, and with good reason, but what the assessor's office does and how it does it has profound implications, not just for the bank accounts of you and me and millions of Cook County residents, but for how wealth, poverty, and power are distributed in our communities. So we are pleased to have as our guest here, Cook County Assessor Fritz Kaegi. Assessor Kaegi has been in office since 2018, when he ran as a reform candidate and unseated longtime incumbent Joe Berrios. Assessor Kaegi has been dealing with countless challenges and some really tough criticisms throughout his tenure. We hope this forum will help clarify for many of us what the assessor's office actually does and explore some of those challenges and criticisms that have come up over the last few years. I do want to emphasize that Reform for Illinois does not endorse or support any political candidates. We invited Assessor Kaegi's challenger, Metropolitan Water Reclamation District Commissioner Carrie Steele, to this forum. We got no response to our invitation, so we went ahead and scheduled the event with Assessor Kaegi. After we began publicizing the event, we did hear from the Steele campaign, but the commissioner was unable to join us. Finally, I want to say that if you value forums like these and the work that organizations like Reform for Illinois does, please take a minute to click the donate link that I dropped at the beginning of the chat. We want to hold more events like this, but we can't do it without your help. And we're grateful for any donation, no matter how small. Now let's turn to our questions. We have so many good questions in the audience that people submitted online. And so much of this discussion covers questions that we got from you, our participants. So let's just start with some nuts and bolts. Many people pay their tax bills and have no idea what goes into determining how much they pay. Tell us what your role is in determining that, what your office does, and tell us what your office doesn't do.
Great, thanks, Alisa. Thanks everyone for being here, joining us from home. I know we're all overcoming a lot to be here tonight, and thanks everyone for taking the time at this time of night during the dinner hour. So what does the assessor's office do? The assessor's office estimates the value of property, from the smallest home to the biggest skyscraper and everywhere in between. It also applies exemptions, which allow homeowners to get reductions off of the top of their property tax bill. What we do is very important because it determines how burdens are shared amongst all the properties in the community. Our assessments are interconnected. This is the most important thing to understand when you think about us. So if one big property is undervalued, all the other property owners basically pick up the tab for that property that's undervalued. So this office is all about equity in the end. We need to be fair to everyone, value their properties from smallest to largest, and we're supposed to use the market as our guide for how to value them. What don't we do? We don't determine the amount of taxes that have to be collected. That is determined by largely your school districts. About 2/3 of an average property tax bill pays for the education of our children. And then the rest is made up of your local city or village, and then the county, and then other services that come with it. The treasurer sends out your bills, and the clerk calculates rates. So basically, the clerk determines how we divide all that money that has to be collected amongst all of the assessed values. But think of us as the office that's about equity within the property tax system.
Okay, so some questions that we had into the nitty-gritty a little bit from the audience. If someone experiences a big jump in their assessment, as one of our audience members did, say for a vacant lot, what might explain that?
What our job is to do a snapshot of what the value of that property is at the time that we measure it. So usually it's as of January 1st. So assessments that we did in Chicago last year were measured as of January 1st, 2001. And where is the market for that lot or for that home or for that commercial building on that day? And we use lots of data and different models to try to replicate what the market would value that property at. The challenge for us is in a 3-year period, maybe only 10 to 15% of properties in a place are sold and the others are not. And we have to extract information from the ones that are sold to value the ones that haven't been. So what could explain it? A big jump. It could be that the market has risen in your community. It could be that your property might have been undervalued before. There could be other reasons. There could be a change of use. Maybe you had something built on your property. The key thing for you to understand is, have you been treated fairly, is how did we estimate the market value of that piece of property compared with what you know it to be? And if it's more than 10% off, you might want to appeal to us because we might have gotten it and we might be off base. The key thing to know is that if your assessment increases, it does not translate into the same change or even the same direction of change in your tax bill, because I mentioned that assessments are interconnected. How much your assessment changes will lead to a change in your bill depending on how much the total assessed value in your community changed. And if your assessment changed by less than the total assessed value in your community, your bill could go down. And a good example is that, most places that we've reassessed in Cook County over the last 3 years have had their assessments go up, yet Cook County residential property tax bills were up only 1%. So that gives you a sense that you could have assessments go up, but bills not go up much at all or even decline.
Okay, so I think one important thing for people to understand that maybe a lot of people don't understand is that the assessments don't automatically dictate what you're paying in taxes, as you said.
Right.
So just because your assessment goes up doesn't mean that your taxes are going to go up. Because
Yeah.
I know there were a lot of people freaking out about higher assessment bills.
Yes.
Thinking they went up 40% or whatever, and that was what their taxes were going to go up by.
Right. So in Chicago, when we reassessed it last year, the base in Chicago is up about 50%. So a lot of people whose assessment were up 20%, 30%, they think, oh, is my bill going to go up that much? And actually not. For many of those people, their bill would be on track to go down because the base is up so much more than their own assessment. So that's one of the things that's counterintuitive. Right. A lot of people who've moved here from the rest of the country, they're sort of used to fixed rates. You apply a fixed rate to your assessment, but that's not the case here in Illinois. You have to think about how you're interconnected with others to understand the implications for your bill. I wish it was simpler, but that's the way it is.
Okay, so I think, many of us have probably appealed our assessments to the assessor's office, maybe beyond, but maybe people don't know anything about the process. What can you tell us about what avenues people have to appeal their taxes, and how does your office evaluate appeals?
Well, let's first examine that phrase, appeal your taxes. That's really not what you're doing. So you're appealing your assessment because you think that our estimate of the value of your home was incorrect. And it can be incorrect for any number of reasons. Maybe we didn't know all the right things about your home, that we thought you had a finished attic, but you didn't. Or maybe we've been looking at homes that aren't really comparable to yours. So when you appeal, you're basically saying that, hey, you overestimated the value of my property for this X, Y, and Z reasons. And here, can you take another look at it? Or here's the evidence to show that that you did overvalue my home. And then we look at that. The sign of a healthy assessment system is when appeals are low, because then it shows that people have an estimate. We're estimating the value that's in the ballpark, and you're not mad enough to file an appeal, or you're not encouraged to appeal even though it's unnecessary. And when I came into this office, it was bonkers. We had more than a third of people appealing just because they thought they had to, even if even if they didn't think they were necessarily undervalued, just because they thought they should. We're starting to get on top of this. Appeals have declined for 3 straight years now, even though it's never been easier to appeal. And appeals are down about 25% versus the last time we reassessed Chicago. And we think that means we're going in the right direction. More people are satisfied with how we're doing this. Maybe there's a little bit more trust in the system after so many years of distrust. But like anyone, when you're assessing the value of 2 million properties, sometimes you can be off the mark. And that's why we have the appeals process. So you can appeal online. It's never been easier. You don't need to hire a lawyer. It's free. You can do it at the assessor's office website. And more and more people of the people who are appealing are doing it themselves and keeping more of their money when their appeal is successful.
And how does your process? We had some audience members who were from different counties and wondered how your process might be similar or different from other counties.
Well, one thing in terms of how we value properties, or how appeals are done, or
let's stick to appeals for now.
Okay. So one of the things that kind of surprises people when they move from out of state to come here is how prevalent appeals have been, and how they were almost encouraged in the past. And then when Chicagoans move elsewhere in the country, they see how unusual it is to appeal there because their assessors usually get things in line, and there's not this culture of feeling like you have to appeal. So, we created online appeals, so it's never been easier. A lot of assessment jurisdictions don't have online appeals. We have, not only our main office downtown where you can make an appointment online or phone in, so you don't have to stand in line, but we also have branch offices where you can do this. So we facilitate it very easily in this county. When I came in, we saw this scene that looked like the end of the Raiders of the Lost Ark, where you had all the boxes stacked up one next to another to the end of the horizon. There was a whole city block of appeals. It weighed 600 tons.
Wow.
Just the appeals we received in 2018. 2 punchlines. First of all, no fire extinguishers. So that kind of worrisome when you have that much. Second of all, they were filed in the order they were received. So if we wanted to extract useful information from these appeals on the community that you live in or elsewhere, we would have to fish through thousands of boxes. So all this data was being wasted. So we've really moved beyond that. Now we have most of our appeals coming in electronically, and we're glad to do it. In the rest of the state, our state has a lot of venues for appeals. There are 4 different ways to appeal in our state, which is more than any other state that I know. That does make the system more inequitable in our state than elsewhere, because the more rounds of appeals you have, the more you're catering to the smaller group that appeals, to the disadvantage of people who don't. And a measure for equity for our office is, how are we doing for the average person who doesn't appeal? We think that's the best measure of an assessment system, because once you get beyond that, these other venues, they only care about the people who are appealing. They don't have any responsibility to the people who aren't. And we're kind of unique in that respect. And we want to make sure that we're looking out for those folks who usually are the most disadvantaged person in our system.
Let's spin that out a little. We're going to talk more about the Board of Review later, but can you talk about how you work with the Board of Review? First of all, what the Board of Review is, what your role is vis-a-vis the board, and how that appeal would move from your office to their office. Sure.
So for most folks don't know who the Board of Review is. It's another body of Cook County government that takes appeals once an assessment has been done at our office. So once we send out an assessment, you get a chance to appeal at our office. We render a decision on that. We reach a final decision, and then we send the data on that area up to the Board of Review. The Board of Review, if you decide to appeal there, takes appeals there. They render their decisions, and it comes back to the assessor's office, and then we send it to the clerk. The clerk calculates rates, and then the treasurer calculates bills, and then that is a full tax cycle. one of the upshots of the Board of Review is that, it can change the nature of the property tax base once we've done something. So it's like another pair of hands on the steering wheel in our property tax system. Most of the places that we've reassessed, homeowners have had a smaller share of the burden from the Berrios era. But we've seen in most of the places where the Board Review then takes appeals, that tends to put the burden back on homeowners because they make most of their cuts for commercial property owners. Last year, the Board Review cut commercial property assessed value by more than $2 billion, but residential values by only about 200 million, so 11 to 1. So that can change the nature of the property tax base, and it changes burdens, and it can put more burdens back on a homeowner.
Okay, and there's another body appeals body, PTAB. Do you want to talk for a minute about that? I know you've had some criticisms about PTAB and some of the things it's done.
Sure. So you can also appeal at the circuit court, and you can appeal at this body called the Illinois Property Tax Appeals Board, which was, used to not include Cook County because it was seen as redundant. Downstate, most people at their assessor's office, they don't appeal there. So PTAB serves like the Board of Review for most people downstate. But in Illinois, it was like a whole nother layer of appeals that was redundant. And what it's ended up doing is basically giving the biggest property owners another bite at the apple, which tends to reduce further their share of the burden at the expense of everyone else. And when the Property Tax Appeals Board does this, PTAB, it's after assessments are done, and any reduction ends up being a refund check issued by your local school boards and villages to those people making appeals. So Trump Tower made an appeal on their value using pretty specious logic, pretty specious evidence. And the Chicago Public Schools had to write $1 million check, and the city had to write $1 million check to Trump for something that dated back to 2011 or in the early 2010s, just this year. So there's this accumulating body of appeals that are like a ticking time bomb for us taxpayers, for taxing bodies, all from those Berrios years that are still accumulating, and hundreds of millions of dollars are being issued in refunds every year at the expense of our taxing body. So Barbara Flynn Curry, a former Illinois House Majority Leader and representative from my original home neighborhood of Hyde Park, and we co-wrote an op-ed saying that we need to remove PTAB from Cook County again. This almost passed in 2003. It was extended to Cook County in the dead of the night with hardly any debate in the mid 90s by a Republican legislature. We really need to take PTAB out of Cook County so that this accumulating time bomb of these appeals is no longer there. This redundant body, which really just makes our system even more inequitable, is not necessary in Cook County, and we should put it past us. And so we proposed legislation before the General Assembly that would remove them from Cook County again.
So just to repeat this point, what happens with these successive layers of appeal? Because to ordinary people, to me at first, it sounds great to have, multiple layers of appeal. If you don't get if you don't get relief on the first try, you should have a couple more bites at the apple. But what you're saying is that it's generally wealthier property owners who have the means to appeal, to hire the attorneys, et cetera, necessary to appeal at the Board of Review, but even more so at the level of the Property Tax Appeals Board. And so those wealthier property owners are getting tax breaks and or breaks on their assessment that may translate into tax breaks, and that burden gets redistributed on the rest of us and on poorer communities.
That's right. There are no free lunches with appeals. If one person's appealing, someone else has to make up the difference. If their share of the burden is falling, the burden gets shifted to others. And if you have multiple instances of appeals where insiders and the wealthiest property owners are shrinking their piece, puts more burden on everyone else. Someone needs to think about the forgotten homeowner and the person who doesn't appeal in the small businesses in this process. And that's why things like this are just a classic instance of structural inequity, structural inequality. And We need the ability to have appeals. That is proper. So that's what the assessor's office has them for and the board review has them for. But once you get to third and fourth bites at the apple, it's just pure inequity with real financial consequences for our schools and our villages and homeowners and people who pay the tab.
Okay, when you ran a few years ago, you ran as a reform candidate opposite Joe Berrios, who lost his seat to you after a series of corruption scandals and exposés showing that his assessments were overburdening poorer communities, particularly communities of color, and putting too light a burden on wealthier property owners. Tell us what you're doing differently and how Berrios's practices continue to affect your office and the assessment process.
Happy to. So if there's one thing that I'd like everyone to leave with tonight, it's that, by us making sure that even the largest properties are valued in line with the market, just like smaller commercial properties and homeowners have been, we've made sure that the biggest property owners are paying their fair share, and the burden on folks in the neighborhoods, homeowners and small businesses has been reduced. Last year in 2021, the average residential property tax bill fell in Chicago for the first time in a decade. And then with the reassessment of Chicago in the last year, homeowners' share of the burden has fallen by 11 percentage points. What does that mean? That means that somewhere between $500 million to $1 billion could be staying in Chicago's neighborhoods with homeowners and small businesses where they used to be picking up the tab for the big buildings downtown because they were artificially undervalued. By making sure that they were valued in line with the market, that has made our system more equitable. That's the most important thing that we do. So that's what I wanted to leave everyone with tonight. Under Berrios, what third-party data has shown is that there is huge amounts of wealth, billions of dollars transferred from especially Black and brown neighborhoods, but all homeowners, to the biggest property owners who are artificially underassessed. These are multinational corporations, oftentimes not even American corporations, that own these big buildings. And they were chronically underassessed by about 50% in Chicago, according to a gold standard study, 40% overall in the county. And it wasn't true of all commercial properties. A lot of small commercial properties, especially in the neighborhoods, they were valued in line with the market and they were paying too much. But it was the biggest ones that even the bigger you got, the greater the disparity became. And that's what really exploded out into the open, that people realized about what was happening under Berrios. There was a series in the Tribune called The Tax Divide that won national awards that really looked at this, because people had known that there was favoritism and shady dealings and lack of transparency at the assessor's office, but people never realized what it meant, what the implications were. And the implications were wealth taken away, money taken out of neighborhoods, disinvestment, people displaced, and really appalling instances of inequality. And we have completely replaced all of the valuation models that were used. Third-party studies are showing that our values are much more in line with the market. We show our work. We show how we calculate the value of commercial properties and residential properties. We've become a leader in transparency when this office used to be known for being opaque. And we put in place a strict ethics order, Alisa, that has, again, changed the environment at the office. This office used to be known for nepotism, for lack of professionalism, for favoritism, especially being cozy with property tax lawyers who dominated the donations going into the assessor's office. We've flipped that around. We don't take any donations from property tax appeals lawyers or appraisers. We've created a source of support that instead comes from thousands of donors who have a higher civic perspective. We've anonymized appeals so people don't see the identity of lawyers handling commercial appeals. And we created a visitor's log, and we forbid the hiring of relatives. So this is just some of the things we've done to upgrade the ethical environment at the office.
You talked about some of the steps you've taken to make the process more equitable and the assessments more equitable. Can you drill down a little bit more? What are some of the long-term implications, some of the long-term impacts of these inequitable assessments on communities? You talked about, just unequal burdens on different property owners, but what impact can this have on our communities long term?
Sure. So let's just look at disparities in commercial assessments. In 2018, a gold standard study looked at the assessments in the last year of the Berrios administration, and it compared them with sales that actually happened. And it found that commercial properties were 40% underassessed across the county, about 50% in the city. What that meant was that a typical homeowner in Chicago's bill was more than $1,000 per year higher than it should have been. That's what it meant for an average homeowner. This is true in a lot of suburban communities as well, where there are these big commercial valuation disparities. And that's an immense amount of money that's taken out of neighborhoods. One of my supporters is Alderman Tony Beal of the 9th Ward, where Pullman and Roseland are. And he was really happy that they just had their first sit-down restaurant open in a couple decades. And if you think about that, there probably were a lot of entrepreneurs in those communities who had an idea to open up a single family restaurant, but they couldn't make the numbers work, or they couldn't get someone to invest in them because the burden on a store like that was too big, and too much money was being taken out of the community because homeowners were bearing too much of the burden. With fairer assessments on the big buildings, folks in Pullman and Roseland who are interconnected will have a lower share of the burden, and that means millions of dollars can stay in their community where they should have stayed all along. And those entrepreneurs who want to open a small business have more of a fair shot. And that's what all this means. It's about making sure that the biggest buildings are participating in paying for the costs of government, just like everyone else, that the value of their property is in line with the market, just like everyone else's has always been. And that's why what we do here is purely about equity. And those decisions that you make have huge consequences for everyone else in the system.
Okay, so you've given us a great explanation of what you're trying to do, but you faced some very serious criticism during your first term from a wide range of groups. Developers and commercial property owners seem pretty unhappy with the way you've hiked assessments on commercial properties. And indeed, many of them have donated to your opponent. Just today, the Chicago Federation of Labor endorsed your opponent. Why are these groups unhappy, and how do you respond to concerns that your assessments may deter business investment, particularly in a time when commercial real estate is struggling with COVID?
Well, first of all, we're really proud of the labor support that we do have from United Working Families and others. I think it shouldn't surprise anyone watching out there, especially folks who've been involved with Reform for Illinois, that when you beat someone like Joe Berrios, who oversaw the system that was so unfair, that there were many people who were winning from the system being broken before, and you can understand why they might want it to be broken again. Property tax appeals lawyers, they make more money when the system's more inaccurate, when everyone feels like they have to appeal and they can get a special deal, or wink, wink, I know someone at the assessor's office. So property tax appeals lawyers are kind of happier when the system is most dysfunctional. And as we've tried to repair it, they want it broken again. And big building owners, you can understand if the consequence of our policy is that we're making sure that they're paying their fair share, they don't want to do that. I think we can understand why. They don't have really an argument that our numbers are not fair. Study after study shows that they are. They just don't want to pay their fair share, and so that's also why they want a system that is broken again. And unfortunately, they have influence over some building trades. So I think you can understand the pattern here. And when you take on reforming a system that's been this broken, just everyone should know that those folks who were out there benefiting from the system who are broken don't go away. So to sustain the momentum, it takes people focused on good government and economic equity, like the folks watching out there, to make sure that the reforms can continue and who have a higher perspective. You know, those interests, they all have real narrow interests in the system being broken, but most people are hurt by it. You know, we represent the larger community, millions of people who were hurt by a broken system. We all deserve to have one that's fair. And, you know, it's not impossible. Around the country, a lot of people don't have to watch a forum on an assessor's election like we have here. And we can get to that. You know, this election is going to be about, do you want reform to continue in this office after we've shown all this progress, or do you want it broken again?
Are you concerned that the hikes in commercial assessments that you've put into place will deter investment, especially coming out of COVID?
No, because we're seeing really robust activity happening with very credible investors from around the world coming here to Chicago when they weren't coming before. We saw a nearly record price paid for an office building downtown just earlier this year by a sophisticated out-of-town investor. We're seeing record prices being paid for industrial space and for apartment space. We have a really good environment for investing in those things because vacancy rates in apartments are low. People want to live in the city and in the suburbs, and there's really a demand for apartment space. We're seeing new industries being created, like data centers. We had acquirers buying those buildings this year, and we have life sciences projects so that Chicago become part of the biotech and healthcare economy. Those are being on the drawing boards too. So we're seeing people put money into Chicago, even as we're having a more fair assessment system. And the reason why is that it's more predictable. People from around the country who are used to systems in other parts of the country that are more normal, they were kind of off-put by how things were in Cook County before. They didn't like the idea that you would hire an alderman as a property tax appeal lawyer to help you get a special deal. For a lot of people, that was a no-go sign of things, and they like that our system is more normal here, and we're seeing, you know, people vote with their feet and bring money to Chicago and the suburbs. And that's, to me, that's the evidence that even in an environment as challenging as COVID, that this all is succeeding.
Okay, let's move on to your relationship with the Board of Review. This has been a thorny topic that's come to a head in the past couple of weeks. You appear to be at war with the Board of Review. That's, again, the agency that's responsible for handling the next level of assessment appeals. Board of Review Commissioner Larry Rogers has called your tenure a disaster and all but endorsed your opponents. Can you explain the nature of this disagreement?
Well, you know, his remarks are pretty vulgar. He called me worse than COVID, I think, and his remarks were really inaccurate. You know, what I'd like everyone to know is that part of when you change a system like this, folks who were there presiding over it being so broken before, some of them are still there. Commissioner Rogers has been on the scene at the Board of Review for 22 years, I think, during the time which Berrios was laying waste to all these different communities, and he endorsed them time after time. So I think we have to remember that we have a different perspective on this. Now, we are ready to work with Commissioner Rogers and everyone else on making the system fairer, more transparent, and more equitable for taxpayers across the county. And we're ready to work with anyone to fix this broken, unfair system. I'm really proud that we're working with President Preckwinkle with the task force to make sure that we're more in alignment on our methods, on our data, on being accountable for making sure that whatever appeals that we have are in line with market values and not something else. And we think property owners really deserve better than the lack of professionalism that Commissioner Rogers exhibited in those remarks. So, you know, I don't want to engage in these back and forth delays, but I really believe the best course of action is just to focus on the work that we do on behalf of the taxpayers.
Let's talk about delays in the assessments. One of Rogers' criticisms is that assessments will be late this year, in large part of what he claims is your mishandling of the transition to a new computer system. Can you explain that transition, why it was necessary, what its benefits will be, and why it's causing late bills this year?
Sure. So remember I mentioned that Indiana Jones Raiders of the Lost Ark scene where we had the 600 tons of appeals files stacked to the rafters. One of the reasons why it was like that is we had a 40-year-old plus computer system at the heart of our property tax system. And no one thinks that that's a good idea. I mean, this was, the system came into place when I was a kid playing Atari. And my data scientists were actually born after the system was put into place. Really pathetically prehistoric and old, and it has real consequences. And so our county agreed that this was a bad thing. It's been studied to death, and they in 2015 they signed a contract with the biggest company in the world that does this, that has the same system in place in cities around the country. And they paid for it up front and had a plan to deploy it. And our office is the first one to go, and then the clerk and the treasurer's office follows. And so we deployed this over 2 years. In 2020, we deployed it for appeals. That created online appeals when they used to be all paper. And then in 2021, we went live on the whole system. And now we have a modernized computer system, just like our peers do. What's created the delay? Now there's some delay in making sure that we test this and make sure it's accurate. I was talking to the head of IT of a S&P 500 company recently, and he said, wow, you replaced the mainframe? That is really, really hard. And so we did that. And we've been finished with appeals for months. Part of the problem comes from the fact that the board of review was not ready for the switchover. They didn't want to recognize our new system. And so instead, what they required is that we put all of the data in this new system back into the Atari to hand off to them. And we've worked with the Bureau of Technology to do that. We didn't have to do that, but we did it so that they could do their work. That has created additional delays, but we started giving data to them back in November on different townships, and they only start appeals on them in March. So to me, that's several months of delay there. So, but what people need to know here is that it's unacceptable to have a system that's 40 years old, that only a couple elderly people know how to program on, that could fail at any time and really create a disastrous consequences for the property tax system. And if we didn't do it this year, we'd have to do it next year at even higher cost, at even more risk. So that's why we did this. Part of reforming big systems like this, it involves rolling up your sleeves and making it happen. And honestly, I don't think we deserve criticism for doing that thing, which really should have been done before us.
Do you have an idea of when they will come out?
Well, it's really in the hands of the board of review because we have transmitted all but 3 towns to them. They'll be transmitted in the next couple of days. That's several months, but that's not 6 months off of where we've been in the past. And so this is in their hands to make it happen. And I don't think it's appropriate to speculate on when they will come out.
We had a question from the audience. Why didn't you run the old system simultaneously? I know this is something that Commissioner Rogers has brought up as well.
Well, we did. We in 2020, we ran it on we put in place the appeals module. And then in 2021, we went live on the new system, and we are running it simultaneously because they forced us to. We have to take data from the old system and put it onto data on the new system and put it back into that Atari, put it back into the mainframe. We are, but the key thing is that there can, in a property tax system or assessment system, there can only be like one system of record. That's the rule under the law, that we keep the records on what assessed values are, what the characteristics of properties are, and there can only be one system that is that system of record, and that's the new system.
Okay, let's move on to some broader issues. So it's not your job to reform the tax system. That's what we've been focusing on here, on what your role in all of this is. But if you could reform the property tax system, what would you do? Is there anything that what would have to happen for our sky-high property taxes in Illinois to actually go down? How would you make the system more equitable?
Sure. I think, the greatest inequity in our property tax system even comes before the first assessment has been done. And that's because about 2/3 of our property taxes are for schools. And our property taxes are high in Illinois, not so much because of the way assessments work, but because our school districts are forced to take on more of the cost of educating our children than any other state in the union. We are dead last in the United States of America in Illinois for the state supporting school districts budgets. We cover about 25% of school districts budgets, whereas in the average in the nation is closer to 50%, including in Indiana, where many of us know property taxes are lower. What that means is that the burden of paying for schools falls on communities. In some communities, they don't have much property value, especially in one it's been as segregated as Chicagoland. So if you live in a community in the Southland like Harvey that's been hit by the housing crisis, where housing prices fell 50%, and there's been deindustrialization, and your malls have been hollowed out by Amazon, your tax base is shrinking, but your obligations stay in place because the state makes you cover it all, so much of it. And that means rates are structurally higher in a place like Harvey. It's about 6 times higher than in the city of Chicago. And think about what that means to someone who put their life savings into buying a house in Harvey. That is so unfair. And even if assessments were perfect, that structural inequity would persist. So how do we fix this? I don't want to dwell on laments. Let's dwell on solutions. There are 2 ways that we can really move the dial on this. The first is that the state picks up more of the tab for educating our children, especially for disadvantaged children. And the state has a plan to increase the funding that goes into schools, and that every dollar that comes from the state is $1 less that needs to be levied in taxes. So we're on the way up in the state. We have a long way to go. The other thing that can be done is the federal government chips in more of the same to help disadvantaged students in schools across the country. It's called Title I. It was created by LBJ in the 60s. It's kind of stayed flat. It covers about 5 to 10% of school budgets in the nation. But under President Biden, he's proposed doubling the funding for Title I, which would make a real difference, a noticeable difference in school budgets and levies, especially in places like the Southland and the western suburbs like Proviso. So those are the 2 ways that we can really move the dial on the inequity in property taxes that don't come from assessments. Now, how can we make assessments more equitable? The greatest disparity is in commercial properties, and estimating their value and providing good evidence of their value. We've sought passage of the data modernization bill in Springfield, which would have a data collection framework as exists in other places in the country that would help to better establish what those values are. The big building owners, BOMA, which is supporting my opponent, they have intentionally thwarted this collection of this data. They want to keep the system in the dark, and that creates another layer of inequity. We have pretty good data where we're starting to get to the bottom of this. That's how we've been able to reduce these disparities, but it's important that better data be out there so that we don't get the work that we're doing reversed on appeal in other places.
Okay, thanks for that. We're going to move to some quicker questions, and just in the interest of time, so we can get to as many of them as possible, let's try to keep them, not that your answers have been overly lengthy, they haven't. These are complicated things to explain, but let's try to keep these as short as possible, just so we can move through them as quickly as possible. So one thing that's on the mind of a lot of people right now is inflation. So we had a question asking if you anticipate that inflation will have any impact on assessments or spur any relief for property taxpayers.
Sure. So inflation the thing about inflation that's so hard, we feel it all when we're going out to buy food at the grocery store. I was at the grocery store this weekend, and my eyes kind of popped out because I saw the prices for some of these things. You go to a restaurant, you're paid more than ever you have, and then the gas tank. So everyone's feeling it. It's a great question. The key thing that we can do when it comes to assessments is make sure that that when prices are rising for those big buildings, we had a building downtown that was just purchased for $1 billion. It's only the second time that we've had a building purchased for $1 billion in Chicago ever. We want to make sure that assessments can follow that, and they're not left behind. If they're left behind, if we have those disparities that could widen under inflation, more burdens will be put onto others. So it's more important than ever that we have a good measure of what's happening out there, and that the assessor makes sure that assessments for even the largest buildings are following the market and disparities are not widening. Disparities are what really got us into really trouble with all that wealth transfer that happened under Berrios. So we need to make sure that now that we're fixing it, inflation doesn't take us back. So that's what we're focused on. And you need that from the assessor. You need that commitment and determination.
Okay. What property tax relief is available in Cook County for low-income homeowners?
So there are several. The thing that inserts a level of progressivity into a system that's really inherently regressive, there's something called exemptions. So every homeowner should have an exemption if it's their main residence, but about 30% of homeowners don't. We want more people to have their homeowners exemption, because that can reduce your bill by up to $1,000 in some communities each year. Second of all, we have exemptions for seniors. That's a whole other kind of homeowner exemption. And we're really proud of the fact that in Springfield, we got past automatic renewal of the senior exemption. So seniors don't have to recertify that they're still over 65, which was a ridiculous imposition that had been in place for more than a decade before I came in, and we changed it. And that, people like my father, who recently passed away, were really frustrated some years because they didn't have that senior exemption. They forgot to apply for it. Another exemption that we have for seniors is the senior freeze, which is means tested. And that means if you have adjusted income below $65,000, you can have your assessment frozen in place, even if you're living in a community that has rising housing values. And for folks who are on fixed incomes, that's really important. And we're proud of the fact that there's legislation passed, on the verge of passage in the General Assembly that's going to make it easier for people to certify that they qualify for the senior freeze, because there are many state programs where you have to prove your income. And now if you're participating in those state programs, you'll be automatically qualified for the senior freeze without us having to look through a lot of tax documents, which, who wants to have that barrier to get that? So we're looking for other ways to make sure that the system is fair for low-income residents. But the most important thing we can do is make sure that assessments are fair across the price spectrum. Low-income homeowners have so much riding on the fact that we make sure that big buildings are paying their fair share. That disparity that we had under Berrios that led to hundreds, if not more than $1,000 of excess taxes being paid by homeowners, that needs to be addressed by fixing valuations on those big buildings. That's what's at stake when with an assessor's office and making sure the system's fair for everyone.
Okay, a question on the landlord side of that. Is there a willingness to broaden tax relief programs to more types of properties, including smaller properties, to increase the investment amounts eligible, the number of years of exemptions? This question stems from there's a perception that the local landlord who owns a few 2 and 4 flats and is willing to lease to low-income families isn't getting any support.
So we're really proud that we worked with the General Assembly to get past the Omnibus Affordable Housing Bill last year. And what it does is it creates incentives for the renovation or construction of multifamily housing, so 7 units and above, throughout Cook County and the rest of Illinois. And what this does is it means that if you commit to having a certain percentage of the units in your building tied to incomes rather than market rates, that preserves affordability. The people who make that commitment get their assessment reduced through an incentive that lasts for several years, and that's going to stimulate the construction and renovation of affordable housing and preserve the stock of affordable housing. The other thing for those 2 to 6 flats, what we can make sure of is, again, they have been paying the burden for underassessment, artificially underassessed big buildings downtown. If we're making sure that those buildings are valued in line with the market, just like everyone else's has been, those landlords will have, who own those small 2 to 4 flats, 2 to 6 flats, have a smaller share of the burden too, and they will participate in lower share of the burden in our system. So I constantly remind people that there's interconnectedness, that it's not just about your assessment, but is the rest of the assessment system fair to you? And that's why this office is so important, and having that stewardship is vital for those landlords who own affordable housing in the neighborhoods.
What are your views on eliminating elected township assessors?
I happen to believe that so for those folks who don't know, township assessors are, they're not actually technically assessors. They're not assessing property, but they're kind of like an ombudsman or a consumer representative in our different suburban communities of Cook County. And they serve a really important role because they help the average person navigate our system without having to hire a lawyer. And our township assessors are really deliver great services. They're hardworking. I'm coming to you here from my community in Oak Park. We have a great township assessor here who's beloved. There are many township assessors like that in the rest of Cook, and they work so hard. They're not paid well, but the bang for the buck they deliver the community is great. And why should they be elected? I think it is important that the public have a say in whether they think their system is being fair to them. If a lot of times people ask me, should the county assessor be elected? And I ask, like, what if our system was messed up as it was before, but you didn't have the ability to democratically change who the assessor was? It would be really hard to drive through reform. So by electing assessors, just like electing other offices, the public gets its say, and whether they think the person's doing a good job, taking things in the right direction, or needs a change.
Okay. Tell us more about how you handle persistently vacant commercial properties.
Thank you for asking that. So, for the longest time during our transition, we heard from neighborhood chambers of commerce from places like South Shore and Lakeview and Six Corners about how the assessor's office had created an incentive for vacancy. Basically, if your property was vacant, you could get your assessment reduced by up to 90%. And that seemed to create incentivized vacancy while hurting the neighboring properties that were in good faith staying open. They didn't get the benefit of the foot traffic. They had to pick up more of the tax burden because this property owner was getting a free lunch, basically. And we're not collecting sales taxes like we should, so we have to lean more on property taxes, and it hurts vitality in the neighborhood, hurts employment. So what did we do? We created a policy that better reflects what's going on in the market. We give credit for the local vacancy rate to every commercial property, whether it's open or closed. So if you're keeping your business open and there's a 30% neighborhood vacancy rate, you get credit for neighborhood vacancy. And so you're not being penalized for being open, you're being rewarded for being open more than the average property. And if you are still keeping your property vacant, you get partial credit for the additional amount of vacancy that you have, but only temporarily. And so what this is doing is it's stimulating we're hearing this from aldermen, we're hearing this from neighborhood chambers, it's stimulating more spaces being open. We also have done two other things that I'm really proud of. We worked with the Cook County Board of Commissioners, Commissioner Donna Miller, so that properties that were getting incentives but were vacant, you could go to the mayor and the mayor could say that, look, you've kept your property vacant for 2 years after getting this incentive. We're withdrawing the incentive from you unless you open. So that came into place a couple of years ago. That's an additional tool to reduce vacancy. And on the verge of passage in the General Assembly right now is a bill that's going to stimulate the opening of vacant space in our Southland. If there's a municipality or land trust that owns property that's been vacant, that's not paying any taxes, if it's reactivated over a period of 12 years, we'll phase in the assessment to stimulate so many spaces that have been vacant. We're so proud of all this work that we've done to address this problem of vacancy, which people know has been abused.
Okay, we had a question about your staff and how you've made diversity on your staff a priority.
It's really important to do this because in the industries that we're in, we draw on data science, we draw on finance, we draw on technology and the law, and these are fields that have all had underrepresentation of Black and brown people. I'm really happy to say that about half of our executive staff is Black and brown and highly represented by women as well. So, my number two, our chief deputy assessor is a Latina. Our number three, our chief administrative officer is a Black woman. Our chief data officer is a Black woman. And the person who heads hiring as the deputy for HR is a Black woman. And so this is part of the commitment that we do. There are not many assessors in America that have this representation. We hired the former assessor of Philadelphia to help increase the diversity too. So we're really proud of that.
Okay, we'll try to just take maybe one more question before we wrap up. There are so many more that I wish we could get to. I do want to say that if people have specific questions, some of the questions we got were very case specific about, timelines for filing appeals, et cetera. So please reach out to Assessor Kaegi's office about questions like that, because there'll be a resource for you there. A question that we had: what is the main difference, besides your experience as assessor, between you and your opponent in the primary election?
Well, I think it's a real lost opportunity that we're not able to have a conversation and a debate tonight with two people who are asking for your vote. This work is really important. Good government and economic equity are what this office is about. And a lot of people don't understand the property tax system. It's really a shame that my opponent's not available here, is not appearing before the media or taking questions. I think that's a pretty big contrast. And, I'm troubled by the ethical things that we've seen so far in my opponent's campaign. We've really tried to raise the bar on ethics, and we have a really wide, diverse base of people who support our campaign, but we're seeing big building owners and people whose interests are tied to it really dominating contributions to my opponent. My opponent was handing out cash with Willie Wilson and Jeannie Ives, who's a really extreme Republican, at an event where she was gathering signatures. So that's troubling too. This office has a really terrible legacy of ethical problems and problems with transparency and not being fair to everyone, providing really providing favoritism. We cannot afford to go back to that. And that's what's going to be at stake in this election.
One last question: if you do win a second term, what will be your biggest challenge?
Well, the biggest challenge is to make sure that we keep the gains that we have, where homeowners are finally bearing less of the burden by making sure that the biggest, as I mentioned, if anyone takes anything away tonight, by making sure that the biggest buildings are finally paying their fair share and not being undervalued anymore. It's keeping lower burdens on homeowners and folks in the neighborhoods. And so it's really important to keep that. We're going to make sure that we get better and better data so that we can reduce any disparities that are still persisting. One of the things that I'm really proud of is that I'm leading a group of the top 15 assessors in the nation that represent more than 50 million people in an effort before the White House. We've met with the Domestic Policy Council and federal regulators who oversee our mortgage system to get access to appraisal data about the building conditions so that we can make property taxes even less regressive and not overvalue homes at the bottom end of the price spectrum, because we can have better information about building conditions. Maybe people haven't renovated it, or they haven't renovated their home in many years. We're seeking access to that data, and that's an example of how we can continue to raise the bar at this office on making property tax systems fair, so the average person isn't picking up the tab for people who have more influence for the biggest building owners. And that's really what's at stake, so we can continue to make those gains. The other thing, Alisa, is that now that we have a new computer system in place, we can roll out so many different services. So just last week, we opened up how we came up with the value of each commercial property. You can go and look at each commercial property and see how we came up with its value. We couldn't do that with our old system, and now you can. And we're going to be able to have more services out there that save people money and better serve them. And that will be the other thing that we have ahead in the next administration.
Okay, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Thank you to everybody again who took time out to be with us today. We got lots of requests for viewing this recorded webinar. It has been recorded by CAN TV and broadcast there, and will be broadcast again and will be available on our website within a couple of days. So thanks again, Assessor Kaegi, for your patient answers to all of our questions. I'm sorry to those whose questions we couldn't get to, but hopefully this will just be the beginning of a conversation. Thank you so much again, and have a good night, everyone.
Thanks, Alisa. See you later, guys. Thanks for joining us tonight.